Hello, so we are back with Chapter 12, Section 4. We're continuing our series through East Asia, and then now we're into Southeast Asia. We're going to take a look at a little bit of Japan, and then Section 5, we'll talk Korea, Vietnam region. So what we're going to take a look at today are feudal powers in Japan. If you understand feudalism, it's something that went on not only in Japan, but also in regions of Europe as well during the Middle Ages or the medieval times. So today we'll start with Roman numeral 1, which talks about the growth of Japanese civilization. And a spot that we usually start with, we'll focus on geography. Japan is an archipelago. It's a series of islands, okay? Most people lived on the 4 largest islands, which are listed here. I'll show you a quick map, but before we go there, Japan is actually very mountainous. Only about 12% of the land is actually suitable for farming. Typhoons, earthquakes, and tidal waves are also major threats. And so those are some of the things geographically that Japan faces to this day. Okay, I'll switch to the quick map here so you can see in your textbook here, the map is located there. You can see some of the main lands here. Here's the main islands. There's Hokkaido. Honshu is one that's very heavily populated. You have Shikoku and Kyushu right here. These are the 4 largest and main islands. You can see that there are other small chains of islands here in the archipelago as well. Okay, next we'll talk capital B, early Japan. Early on, Japan was not a unified country, but instead was made up of many independent clans. The people there worship many gods and goddesses. This type of worship became known as Shintoism or Shinto. Shinto or Shinto, sometimes people say it, is basically meaning the way of the gods. And it's based on respect for the forces of nature and worship of ancestors, sort of like filial piety and Confucianistic ideologies in early China. It's driven by what are called kami or kami. These are divine spirits that are believed to have dwelled in nature, like dwelling in trees, rocks, waterfalls, things of that are found in the natural world. Capital C talks about the Yamato emperors. When you take a look at that, by the 400s, the Yamato clan had emerged as the most powerful clan. Eventually, they became the leading family and ruled as emperors. Many rival clans continued to fight for overall control of Japan, but this led at times to what was known as a dual leadership setup, where there was an emperor, but the emperor was more or less a figurehead, really didn't hold any true power. And then there was also a ruling power that came from one of the winning clans of some of these inter-clan and tribal warfares. Next is going to talk about Japanese culture a little bit. One of the things that eventually became a part of Japan is Buddhism. This is because of Korean and Chinese travelers that brought many ideas through cultural diffusion to Japan. Buddhism was actually officially accepted by the government of Japan or the leadership in Japan by the mid-700s. Therefore, what ended up happening is that Buddhism and Shinto, which were the 2 main religious practices at that time, kind of blended and became a third form. So you had Buddhism, you had Shintoism, and then you had a third form, which was actually a blend of those 2 that came about during that time also. Capital letter B is going to talk a little bit further about that cultural diffusion that was happening in China. One of the biggest Japanese converts to Buddhism was named Prince Shokoku, who served as actually a regent ruler for a female empress named Empress Suiko. A regent now is someone who rules when a monarch is absent, ill, or even too young to rule. We've seen this quite often throughout history. You know, when we take a look at Hatshepsut, who ruled while her stepson was too young. And then we will continue to see more and more of a situation like that as we continue through the class. But in 607, he sent several actual missions into China with the purpose of studying Chinese civilization. And this would continue for the next roughly 200 years. Over time, the Japanese adapted many things from China, but they also kept their own cultural practice and traits intact. Roman numeral 3 talks about a time period called the Heian period, and they formulated a new capital. In the late 700s, the capital city was moved from the city of Nara to the city of Heian, which is actually modern-day city of Kyoto. This time period in Japanese history is known as the Heian period. It spanned from 794 to 1185. A highly refined court system and society arose in Heian. This The court system is basically the group of advisors, officials, diplomats that are serving in high government or are around the emperor or king for the purposes of trade and diplomatic discussions. There were many rules that had to be followed in this Heian court system. Etiquette was extremely important. For example, things like laughing aloud in public was really frowned upon. The women of the court actually kept diaries, essays, and novels that give us as historians a lot of key history on this era and location. One of the most famous was a female author named Lady Murasaki. Her masterpiece was called The Tale of Genji. It's a very popular piece of literature. It actually was an account of the life of a prince in Heian Court. Question is whether the prince was real or not. That's questionable, but it kind of just talks about how princes lived, how they were treated, and so on and so forth. And this became the world's first true novel in our history, The Tale of Genji from Japan. Also, Roman numeral 4 talks about feudalism and how it sort of chipped away at imperial authority. So feudalism eventually replaces the concept of an emperor for some time. And this is due to the decline of the central power. During most of the Heian period, the Fujiwara family held the power. Toward the middle of the 11th century, which would be meaning the 1000, so around 1050, the Fujiwara power began to fade. Large landowners in the countryside began to create large and private armies. So therefore, small landowners were being attacked by these large landowners. So what they started to do is they began to trade small portions of their land to warlords in exchange for military protection. And those warlords would be kind of like the knights of the medieval times. Those are going to become known as samurais here in a moment. But with more lands that the lords were gaining, the more power they had. And this is basically the concept of a feudal system. Now, samurai warriors are those warlords that I kind of mentioned here in a second. And I'll show you here momentarily what a Japanese warrior known as a samurai would have looked like. This is an example of a samurai. So they're specialized soldiers that they would train to fight, and they had a certain code that they would try to follow, kind of like the code of chivalry that is evident in medieval times of Europe. The code that they follow was called Bushido, and we'll take a look at that next. Okay, samurai warriors. That page, if you want to reference it, is page 342. Wars between lords were very common. So what would happen is that each lord would recruit protection from a highly trained soldier called a samurai. Now, a samurai means one who serves. And the samurai lived by a special code of behavior called Bushido, which, as I said earlier, is very similar to the European form of chivalry. Bushido actually means way of the warrior. Under this code, the samurai was expected to show courage, reckless courage, reverence for the gods, fairness, and also generosity toward those who were deemed weaker than himself. Dying an honorable death for a samurai was more important than living a long life. Capital letter C is going to talk about the Kamakura shogunate. During the late 1100s, there were two powerful clans that began to have civil war, and they would battle for roughly 30 years until the Minamoto clan or family was victorious. In 1192, a leader named Yorimoto from that family was named shogun. Shogun means supreme general of the emperor's army or military dictator. So what was happening is there was an emperor. The emperor couldn't really control the land, so he had to recruit a shogun who was a military general. Really, the shogun's calling the shots. The emperor is serving as the figurehead. This is kind of like early Japan, this two-ruler system where the emperor is there but not really calling the shots. In this case, the shogun is really calling the shots. The emperor still ruled from the city of Kyoto, which at that time was the capital. It was formerly known as Heian. But the shogun sort of operated and controlled the military from a city called Kamakura. This is why the time period of the 1200s are known as the Kamakura shogunate. Eventually, the Mongols under Kublai Khan invaded, and although the shogunate defeated them, it cost the Japanese people a great deal of money and effort. And so even though they fought off those invasions by the Mongol and the Chinese at the time, what ended up happening is they used samurai who they told that they would pay money to from the government to help to defend against these attacks. But those samurai never got their pay. And so they became very angry and saw this as a dishonorable and disloyal trait. And so some of those began to lead rebellions against the shogunates, and eventually they were overthrown, which we'll learn about later in the year. Thank you.